When we look at the statistics on business bankruptcies, we see that they're not exploding and that on the contrary, they are decreasing. In June 2020, I already told you that fewer companies went bankrupt during the crisis of the anti-COVID measures than in a normal year, and this can be seen in both the USA and in Europe. The explanation in June was simple. With a financial support due to containment, even companies that would normally have gone bankrupt managed to survive. Very good. I also told you at the time that numerous studies, including those of McKinsey, predicted that 40% of European companies would go bankrupt within 12 months after the end of financial supports. But here we are, one liquidity injection plan after another, and the crisis still isn't happening. As we are aware that a stop of the AIDS will provoke an economic cataclysm, we can ask ourselves the following question. Will the government aid stop one day? And if this crisis never happens, what will be the consequences? What does a globally immortal economic world look like? Come on, let's go. In principle, the bankruptcy of a company allows the market to be cleared so that competitors can make a living. Bankruptcy is a necessary process to obtain a healthy economic fabric where prices actually correspond to the market. One must always keep in mind that a company that is doing badly often makes poor quality and lowers its prices beyond what is reasonable to stay afloat as long as possible. So in a sector where a minority of companies are doing badly, it is all the companies that are at risk because the prices no longer reflect the necessary compromise between production cost and the value that the customer is willing to pay. On the other hand, it is important to remember that too many bankruptcies can kill an economic fabric for 10 years because it no longer has enough productive resources to survive these bankruptcies. Typically, during the crisis of the 1930s, there were far too many bankruptcies for the economy to quickly recover. So, when the crisis hits, politicians are always torn between the need to let fragile companies fail and the feeling that they should save the economy by helping companies get through the crisis. Since the main focus of politicians remains the election, they have a natural bias towards the save the economy solution because getting reelected after an economic debacle is very complicated. I think it is this political bias that led us to the so-called zombification of the economy. In the USA, the problem is less pronounced than in Europe, but it is growing. A zombie company is defined as a company that pays more interest on its debts than it makes in profits. It is virtually dead, but keeps itself alive because it has cash left over from loans from the bank. Every bailout since the dot-com bubble through the great financial crisis of 2008 to the crisis of the anti-COVID measures zombifies our economies a little more. But today it seems that we are at a turning point. The mass of virtually bankrupt companies is so large that it is making every Western leader in the planet dizzy. As a result, Joe Biden is sending nearly $2 trillion directly into the economy to keep up with the shock, and the European Central Banks has announced that it is extending its aid programs for about another 2 trillion euros. And at this point, I think that our politicians might be fundamentally incapable of withdrawing the infusions to the companies or to the population because the damage would be too important to bear, politically speaking. What politicians would be willing to take on the decisions that would cause a severe economic depression that would last maybe 10 years? Isn't it easier for them to consider that their country's economy is too big to fail? If this is the direction we are heading, then what will be the price to pay? First of all, we must be aware that this will not be the first time. Empires grow and often collapse in cycles of about a century or two. It is interesting to observe on this graph that it is the currency that collapses last in a sudden way, while all the other factors tend to decay gradually. However, when the currency collapses, the fall accelerates. The rebound will only take place around a new social, economic, and political balance, of course. I would also like to remind you that any collapse does not necessarily translate into a century of misery, where we return to savagery. When we speak of collapse, it is above all a change of political reality that takes shape around a revolution, that is to say, a change of regime. It is also interesting to note that one of the characteristic stages of a collapse of a society is a questioning of debts. Finally, the revolution and wars phase does not necessarily involve armed conflict. It is a stage where power and elites are challenged. It can happen peacefully. War is not a mandatory step. Well, what would a scenario of the zombification of the economy that would end in a regime change result in? If we admit that we save everyone at the expense of the value of money, then we will witness a very strange form of impoverishment. We will not be overwhelmed by the poor, as in the 1930s, because the impoverishment will not be concentrated on a group of people, but rather spread over the whole population. When a government prints a banknote, it levies a tax on the entire population. If it gives those banknotes to those who would be impoverished, this amounts to a transfer of wealth from the population to those who are most likely to fall into poverty. In this scenario, there is no longer poverty, but an increase in exclusion. Those who leave the system no longer have any possibility of finding a job or an income. They fall out of the statistics and become invisible poor. This is a particularly harsh and unfair situation because almost nobody will notice them. Moreover, many reports on exclusion in the USA and in Europe have been pointing this out for more than 10 years. It is also interesting to note that exclusion on its hardest form is increasing faster in the cities than in the countryside. Statistics are hard to come by, but I'm sure that this crisis of the anti-COVID measures has greatly aggravated the findings. Then you have a second layer of the population maintained in a relatively bearable poverty thanks to aids. Food stamps, stimulus checks, partial unemployment, family allowance, and so on. In the end, these people are part of what we call public assistance. On the one hand, the economy as a whole does not have enough places for everyone to have one. On the other hand, these social aids keep people in an uncomfortable but livable position. As a result, this part of the population has good taste not to revolt, but they do not mobilize to create new economic activities either. This is the version of bread and circuses that was the prelude to the collapse of the Roman Empire. The government buys social peace as to not have to face a fundamental questioning of its authority. Thus, money printing will impoverish the entire population as a whole and will not allow hungry protesters to emerge quickly. So, the question is, what are the economic parameters that will break down and cause this system to collapse? To put it simply, our currency will have less and less purchasing power, even though our politicians will explain to us every night on television that the recovery is ahead of us. It is a bit like what happened in the USSR. People were starving, but in the Communist Party newspapers, the wheat production has always been better from one year to the next. We will have to watch two indicators: the exchange rate against China, the UK, New Zealand, or Switzerland, in short, against well-managed countries. As for the dollar and the euro, they should probably fall together, so we won't notice much on this side. And the external trade deficit. The exchange rate will indicate a loss of purchasing power of our currencies. As for the external deficit, the increase in imports will indicate that the goods produced by the best-managed countries are becoming more and more expensive, and that the decrease in exports, despite a falling exchange rate, will indicate that the quality of our production is decreasing at the same time as the quality of our industrial fabric is deteriorating. If we are indeed heading to what is called a rot scenario, then we will have to be very nimble and able to diversify our savings around the world to avoid getting caught in the trap. One of the signs I look at is the price of Bitcoin. Usually, Bitcoin bubbles up regularly in a long-term bullish cycle. Logically, we are in one of these bubbles. When it stops rising, the Bitcoin consolidates its position rather than falling sharply. That will also be a signal that it is moving from a speculative asset to a store of value. This is unlikely as there are many obstacles, but if Bitcoin does take that position, then in the future, it'll be a great help to protecting our savings. On that note,
thank you so much for watching. If you like my videos, please subscribe and don't forget to hit the bell if you want to be notified of the next episode. And if you want to invest in the stock market over the long term or diversify your financial portfolio, I'm offering you an analysis of the 8 European star stocks to have. Thanks again for watching and have a great day.